All right, everybody, welcome to part 4 of our ongoing discussion of St. Paul the huckster. In Galatians 2, starting with verse 6, Paul went on another rampage, attacking his opponents in the Jewish Christian world. You know, the apostles, James, John, Peter, and all the rest of the Jerusalem believers there. About what was supposed to be, or attacking what was supposed to be his brothers in Christ once again, right? Here's what he said. As for those who were held in high esteem, remember he said this before, high esteem, they're esteemed as being rulers and leaders, but they're really not. As for those who are held in high esteem, whatever they were makes no difference to me. Catch that. And notice how he uses the past tense here. Whatever they were, they used to be highly esteemed, but they're not anymore, at least not among Paul's predominant crowd, right? You know, his Gentile followers, which far outnumbered the Jewish Christian believers. So he's telling them they were highly esteemed, but they're not anymore because he's demonized them so much that only a small group of people were still following them. You see what he's doing here? This is unbelievable. Those, he says, whatever they were, it makes no difference to me. I don't care who they were, that they were original followers of Jesus. I don't care because my version of Christianity dominates now. So I can say and do whatever I want. I can make up any new doctrine I want, and it's going to stick because they don't have any more power over me. Wow. God does not show favoritism, he says. Here he goes with that one again. They added nothing to my message. Can you imagine that? They didn't approve on anything that I've been saying, my gospel that I've been preaching. And he does refer to it as his gospel, as we'll see later. My gospel is superior to theirs. And when he said God doesn't play favoritism here, he's making the point that even though these are Christ's original disciples, God doesn't show them favoritism over me. He's implying that God did show favoritism over him against them, right? That was the implication here. Their message added nothing to mine. Remember before in the last video I quoted Paul as where he said that how did he put it now? I am in no way inferior to the least or to the best of the other apostles. You know, I'm no way inferior. Now here he's implying that he's way above them. On the contrary, he said, they recognized that I had been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the uncircumcised, the Gentiles, just as Peter had been to the circumcised, the Jews. Paul is acting like they gave consent. Okay, Paul, you go to the Gentiles, we'll go to the Jews. They didn't want the Gentiles converted. They didn't want the Gentiles to be declared sons of Abraham. They were always against it. He's making it out like we had an agreement that I was just going to deal with the Gentiles and they were going to deal with the Jews. Oh man, what a schemer. What a conniving scam artist. For God, who was at work in Peter as an apostle to the circumcised, the Jews, was also at work in me as an apostle to the Gentiles. For God, did I say for Paul? For God, who was at work in Peter to minister to the Jews, he was at work in me to minister to the Gentiles, he's saying. He's acting like Peter is still his friend. He's trying to smooth things over. Everything's fine, nothing to worry about. When in fact, he was so vehemently attacking them here. James, Cephas, which is Peter, and John, those esteemed as pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me. They didn't give him the right hand of fellowship like they were friends. They pretty much, let Paul do his thing, right? Keep to yourself, we'll keep to ourselves. You want to go mess around with the Gentiles, keep that to yourself. They didn't shake his hands like they were friends with him. They couldn't stand him. And likewise, Paul couldn't stand them either. But Paul's trying to smooth things over here, making it look like we shook hands, we're buddies now. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised, or the Jews. All they asked from me was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing that I had been eager to do all along. Again, another lie. First of all, nothing was ever mentioned to Paul about caring for the poor on the part of James or any of the other apostles in Jerusalem. We're going to look in a moment what the conditions were that were given to Paul for them to continue to somewhat accept him. But nothing was mentioned there about caring for the poor. I mean, wasn't that supposed to be a given already? At least openly anyway. You were supposed to care for the poor. That's what Jesus was all about, right? But it turns out Paul didn't give a frog's fat fanny about the poor. Paul was eager to remember the poor, he says here. Oh, no. We'll see that later. Hold that thought. We'll come to that. I don't think in this video. It won't be for a couple more from now. But we will look into that, and we will see that Paul didn't give a frog's fat fanny about the poor. Neither did Jesus, right? Remember we talked about that. The poor you will always have with you. But at any rate, Paul was here trying to downplay a huge rift that arose between himself, along with his camp, and the Jewish Christian leaders in Jerusalem, along with their camp, Once again, Peter, James, John, etc., who he said were esteemed as pillars. Instead of Paul admitting that he and his followers were at major odds with these Jerusalemites, because he was teaching Gentiles to ignore old Jewish customs and converting unclean Gentiles, he acted like all their differences were ironed out and that he and his company were offered the right hand of fellowship based only on the condition all they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor. Baloney. Paul was lying here. Paul lied on many other occasions too, as we will see. Oh, did he ever lie? After all, he admitted that he liked to fool people, right? How crafty I am. I have fooled you by trickery. Remember that one. Anyway, the exact stipulations for extending Paul and his Gentile following the hand of fellowship, and it was very reluctantly at that, but the conditions were delivered by James at the what's called the Jerusalem Council. And here are those stipulations, and notice how there was no mention anywhere about the matter of remembering the poor. It wasn't mentioned at all among these. Paul said that that was the only one. It was just one. No, there were several stipulations, none of which was remembering the poor. So here it is from the book of Acts. It is my judgment, therefore, this is James talking, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Instead, we should write to them, telling them to abstain from food polluted by idols. We kind of read this before, but I need to read it now in this context. Abstain from food, from meat sacrificed to idols, animals sacrificed to idols, from sexual immorality, from the meat of strangled animals, and from blood. For the law of Moses has been preached in every city from the earliest times and is read in the synagogues on every Sabbath. Acts 15:19-21. There it is. Those were the stipulations for the right hand of fellowship. They were 3 in number, not 1, like Paul said, and none of them mentioned, again, remembering the poor, like Paul said, was the only condition. What a liar. What a freaking liar. The reason Paul failed to mention these actual conditions is obvious, because he was not teaching Gentiles to abstain from food polluted by idols. Quite to the contrary, as we have seen. Nor was Paul teaching his uncircumcised followers to abstain from meat of strangled animals and from blood. He wasn't teaching any of those things. Rather, he told them, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, Colossians 2:16, right? Remember that? So Paul ignored these actual stipulations given by James and acted like it was something else entirely different, just that we remember the poor. Oh my God, you just can't make this stuff up. This is so colossally, unbelievably fraudulent. This character is a monkey if ever there was one. Modern televangelists had nothing up on this guy. Nothing. Consider also Paul's arrogance in stating that he did not care about the Jerusalem church leaders and what they had to say, and how they added nothing to his message. Paul, let it be stressed again, was talking here about Christ's original disciples, Peter, James, and John, and so forth. He said that whatever they were makes no difference to me. Whatever they were. They're not anymore. I've crushed them beneath my feet. I'm all that matters now. And whatever they were, even if they were that now, but they're not anymore, but whatever they were, it doesn't matter to me. Was he not placing himself on a higher pedestal than them? Of course he was. As far as Paul was concerned, the only thing that mattered was that his new policy be upheld, that the gospel, as he defined it, should be preached to Gentiles as well as to Jews, and in the way that he prescribed. In Paul's mind, only his teachings and methodologies were of any significance. All else be damned. Something else to note from Paul's above-cited rant is his claim that they, the Jerusalem believers, recognized that I had been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the uncircumcised, or the Gentiles, just as Peter unto the circumcised, the Jews. Essentially, Paul was saying here that it was agreed for him to go in one direction, and for Peter, along with the other Jerusalem believers, to go in another direction. But the reality was probably much different. We might conclude from this that Paul was glossing over the fact that he had most likely been banished from Jerusalem by the Christian Jews there, although we can safely assume that they may have relayed this message to him privately to avoid a major split in the church, right? The whole thing would come crumbling down if it was known that the top leaders were having this massive disagreement and couldn't come to terms with each other. Notice how Paul, even though he was cutting them down and saying they didn't matter to him, he was still referring to them as brother, or not as brothers, but, as fellow believers, and acted like they extended the right hand of fellowship. So he was trying to gloss over, even though he's cutting them down, he's still trying to gloss over this massive, gaping rift that, he created between them. This is the most plausible conclusion, that he was probably banished from Jerusalem, seeing that Paul did not receive a warm reception from Jews, whether Christian or otherwise, anywhere he went, as we see from Acts 18:6, for example, which says, "But when they, Jews in a Corinth synagogue, opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, 'From now on, I will go to the Gentiles.'" In other words, I'm not going to have anything to do with, you Jews anymore. We can safely assume that he meant that for Christian Jews as well as non-Christian Jews, right? In fact, the fact that he was banished by Jews there, he must have been banished by Jews in Jerusalem, ultimately, they brought him to trial, right? They were condemning him. So he wasn't welcome there. And you can bet the Christian Jews who were in league with the non-Christian Jews didn't like him around either. They must have had an agreement behind closed doors. Just stay away from us. You work with your Gentile crowd. Do whatever you want. We're going to stay here. You go do your thing. This is what Jesus told us to do anyway. Preach to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. That's what Jesus came for, right? This was the incident, as you can see, that supposedly led Paul to concentrate exclusively on converting Gentiles to Christianity from then on. And while this may be true, understand that his real focus on Gentiles was only because they were much greater in number than the Jews, which amounted, once again, to more money in his pocket and more manpower for future insurrectionist plans. An additional reason why Paul would have been banished by the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem, as well as all the other Jewish communities, non-Christian, is found in the following quote from the Essene Community Rule Scroll, which thusly laid down the common rule at the time for dealing with Jewish anti-Torah heretics. It states, "Any man who enters the council of holiness, walking in the way of perfection, is commanded by God, and whether overtly or covertly, trespasses one word of the Torah or Moses on any point whatsoever, shall be expelled from the council of the community, and return no more. No man of holiness shall associate with him in monetary matters or in approach any matter whatsoever." So there you go. And by the way, did you notice in this quote how it says, "in the way of perfection"? The way. Remember how we talked about how the Essenes called themselves the way? Well, here they are doing that again. And Christianity was called the way too, wasn't it? Paul said that he was a follower of the way, a specific sect called the way. He was the Gentile version, where, the Jerusalem believers were the original Jewish branch of the way. But nevertheless, the fact that Christianity was called the way, they were, in fact, a spin-off of the Essenes. Remember, we talked about that, thoroughly documented that before. So naturally, this Essene rule was observed across the board with all Jewish sects, wasn't it? This is what you did to someone who strayed away from Moses. Even in one iota, even in the slightest bit, if you strayed from Moses, you were to be banished, and nobody in any authoritative position was to have any dealings with you again. You were never again to enter Jerusalem. Paul had to be banished from Jerusalem. And so that's why he says, "It was given to me to go to the Gentiles." That's how he could explain why he didn't go to Jerusalem. He actually did later on. Something changed later on, much later on. We'll get to that. But for the longest time, he never went near the place. Which, suited him just fine because he wanted to work with the Gentiles anyway and build up a big force, blah, blah, blah. But, he was banished. And that's how he explained it away. "We made an agreement that I was going to go to the Gentiles and they were just going to work with the Jews." No, that wasn't the agreement. They kicked his behind out. Anyway, all religious Jews in Paul's day, Christian and non-Christian alike, held to this policy of kicking out those who went against Moses' teaching. We can see that, right? We've already seen with Christian Jews and regular Jews were denouncing Paul for going against Moses. That's why they told him, go into the temple and help this guy out with the Nazirite vow. And Paul did, right? Just for window dressing purpose. Well, it wasn't window dressing. He was really still a practicing Jew, but so he had no qualms with it. But when he talked to his Gentile audience, he certainly did. Anyway. But you can clearly see that they were all rallied against Paul, and for good reason, because he was not practicing Judaism anymore. Not in front of the Gentiles anyway. He was denouncing with these new converts to Christianity, to this new Jewish sect. He was calling them children of Abraham, but yet he wasn't teaching the ways of Moses and Judaism in general. So he was denounced, and therefore he was thrown out for a long time. Anyway, as we have seen, the Jewish Christian leaders, such as the apostles Peter, James, John, held to pretty much all Jewish policies and ceremonial practices, and were, once again, virtually indistinguishable from other Jews, except that they believed in Christ as the Messiah. Thus, they were accepted by and were totally in league with the non-Jewish Christians in the temple leaders. For notice what we read in Acts 8:1, which is speaking of Paul's so-called pre-conversion days. It says, and Saul was there giving approval to Stephen's death. Stephen was stoned, for his Christian faith. Paul gave approval for it. On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem. The Jews rose up against the Christians in Jerusalem and were persecuting them, right? And all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Did you catch that? A great persecution arose against Christian Jews in Jerusalem, and all of them were scattered except the apostles. Why were these apostles, these apostolic Jewish Christian leaders, why were they exempt from this persecution? Think about it. They were totally in bed with the Jewish leaders. Didn't Jesus teach them? Do whatever the scribes and Pharisees say, but don't do as they do because they, but do what they say because they sit in Moses' seat. He was teaching them to have respect for these authorities that he himself clashed with constantly, right? So they were having respect for them. They were totally in league with them. And when a persecution arose, they didn't touch them, did they? Look what was going on here. Oh my God, this is so unbelievable. I never comprehended any of this when I was a Bible believer. It just didn't even dawn on me. I never focused on stuff like this, never investigated it. Just focused, like all other Christians do, on those happy, cozy, comfy passages, the ones that, they smelled so nice. Love your neighbor, blah, blah, blah. Little did I know what crap was in this book waiting for me to discover, but only when I was ready to actually look at them. One final piece of evidence to consider here, showing that Paul must surely have been ostracized from the Jewish community in general, as well as, more specifically, the Jewish Christian community, in Jerusalem, is this next quote from the Kerygmata Petru, which is a 2nd century document created by the Ebionites, which was a Jewish Christian sect, right? Look what they said here. Paul was an apostle of the law, a spouter of wickedness and lies, and the distorter of true teachings of Jesus, many examples of which, of course, we're later going to consider. But look what they said here. Paul was an apostle of the law. He was. He claimed to be against a lot of Moses' law, but he never strayed from the Ten Commandment part of it. He always upheld that. So he was an apostle of the law, but all the while he was a spouter of wickedness and lies and the distorter of the true teachings of Jesus. Oh, we're going to see that, like I promised earlier. We're going to see where he contradicted again and again and again and again and again what Jesus taught. We've already looked at a couple examples of that, right? But oh, so very many more examples we'll look at later. But is this quote lying here? Christians would say, well, that's not an inspired book, so we can't go by that. It's absolutely correct. Whether you think it's worthy of belief or not because it's not inspired doesn't matter. It's a fact. And it can be proven that Paul was this apostate. I'm sorry. It's not calling him an apostle of the law. Apostate. I read that wrong. I'm sorry. An apostate of the law. So yeah, he was an apostle of the law as far as the Ten Commandments go. But the law in general, referring to the writings of Moses, yeah, he was an apostate. At least in his open teachings to what he taught to the Gentiles. Secretly, he still believed in all the Mosaic laws. But he was considered an apostate because he was openly, publicly teaching against much of what Moses taught, right? So yeah, he was an apostate. He was also a spouter of wickedness and lies. Yes, we can prove that and have proved that, and we'll prove it even more right from the pages of the Gospels, that everything said about him here is absolutely true. This same text went on to seriously diminish the veracity of Paul's visions and his conversion experience on the way to Damascus, just as we've been saying, right? That his profession of Christian faith was all a fraud. He never really converted. He never really had any genuine interest in Christ. He just saw this religion, this branch religion of Judaism, as a powerful way to manipulate Gentiles and to exploit them as well. The quote ended off by saying that all of these things, that Paul claimed to be a true Christian and his teachings, blah, 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 were referred to as dreams and illusions inspired by devils, as this quote goes on to say. Paul's dreams and his illusions were all inspired by devils. Rightly so. This Jewish Christian sect called the Ebionites labeled Paul as a complete fraud. He was, absolutely. So it's quite apparent that since Paul was never liked by the Jewish community in general, he indeed must not have had the welcome mat rolled out for him by the Jewish Christian leaders in Jerusalem either. Of course not. Look how he attacked them constantly, cut them down. Look how they were disgusted with him for, converting Gentiles and calling them sons of Abraham. That was an abomination to them, right? Look how he was trampling a lot of the teachings of Moses underfoot. Of course they couldn't stand him. They banished him as much as the non-Christian Jews. They didn't want him around any more than they did. And why should the situation have been otherwise when we consider how Paul constantly berated them, again, in his epistles? Constantly. I don't care what they were. They mean nothing to me. They added nothing to my message. Constantly. He called them devils, false apostles, right? But as time rolled on, though, Paul seems to have been readmitted into their company, at least to some degree, clearly because his following grew too big and too powerful for him and his teachings to be openly resisted any further. One of the reasons for making this assertion about Paul's at least superficial reconciliation is the fact that Peter later referred to him as our beloved Paul in 2 Peter 3:15. You can bet Peter didn't really consider him beloved. He just had to say that again for window dressing purposes, for the sake of both the lower level Gentile and Jewish Christian communities, right? Another reason is the fact that Paul later did visit Jerusalem sometime later when there was a famine there, as we'll expound upon in due time. So there was some degree of seeming reconciliation, but for the longest time, he was not welcome in Jerusalem. There's great reason to believe, though, that the animosity between Paul and the Jerusalem Christian hierarchy never really subsided, but again, was just merely suppressed, kept bottled up inside, even after the so-called reconciliation, right? It was, they kept that bottled inside to conceal it from the laity. But inevitably, these hidden feelings resurfaced and apparently erupted in a violent outburst by Paul. We find out about this incident from a comment made in the Pseudo-Clementine Recognitions, where Paul, who is here called the enemy, on one occasion had assaulted James, throwing him down the temple steps. Is this not right in line with what we would expect from this phony thug who was indeed an insurrectionist and wanted to see the Jerusalem hierarchy taken down as much as the Romans, right? He probably wanted the Christian Jewish hierarchy taken down as well. In fact, we can be sure of that. Look how we talked about them, constantly cutting them down. He despised them. Keeping this before us, it's imperative to also consider what the Recognitions quotes Peter as saying about Paul. Some from among the Gentile followers of Paul have rejected my lawful preaching, Peter said, attaching themselves to certain lawless and trifling preaching of the man who is my enemy, meaning Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, right? He went on to say that Paul was teaching, quote, the dissolution of the law. Yes, the teachings of Moses. And then cautioned his followers to, quote, believe no teacher unless he brings from Jerusalem the testimonial of James, the Lord's brother, or whoever may come after him. Wow. Peter said, don't believe anything Paul said, unless it's endorsed by, James, right? Paul said the same thing in his epistles, didn't he? Even if an angel comes down and preaches anything other than what I and my fellow workers have been preaching, let them be accursed. Remember that? Paul was referring to the Jerusalem Christians when he said that. And now we see that the Jerusalem Christians were saying the same thing about Paul. Whoa! And as we go along, we're going to see why. We've already seen some reasons why, but we're going to see even more reasons why Paul was completely teaching something absolutely antithetical to everything that the Jerusalem Christian Jews were teaching, the original apostles of Christ. Totally in conflict, as we'll see. We can be confident that these statements reflect the genuine sentiments that the Jerusalem Jewish Christian leaders had for Paul in general, at least inwardly, as they are right in line with the sentiments that we know Paul himself had expressed toward them, such as when he said again in Galatians 1:9, as we have already said, so say I now again, says Paul, if anybody is preaching to you a gospel other than what you accepted from himself, from Paul, let them be accursed. Let them be under God's curse, he said. And then there was this statement that Paul made also about them, as we saw earlier from Galatians 5:12. As for the agitators who were pushing circumcision, right? I wish they would go the whole way and emasculate themselves. Oh yes, Paul couldn't stand the Jerusalem Christians, the original disciples of Christ. Couldn't stand them. And they couldn't stand Paul either. We now return to examining more of Paul's address to the Galatians that we were reading earlier from chapter 2, which will bring to light what really caused Peter to see the light about no longer being prejudiced toward Gentiles, right? Remember that discussion? And I said I was going to get to it. I wanted to provide all of this background information first, so you could see this ongoing battle that was going on between Paul and the Jerusalem Christians. Now, armed with that, let's look at what really caused Peter to at least claim that he saw the light and was now accepting Gentiles. He did it reluctantly, and it wasn't because God showed him. This is the real reason why he changed his mind. Picking up with verse 11, Paul boasted, "When Cephas, i.e. Peter, came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, from Jerusalem, he used to eat with the Gentiles." In other words, Peter would compromise his Jewish separatist stance, but only for window dressing purposes when he was away from his fellow Jewish believers, right? When he was in the company of Paul and non-Jewish Christians, he would sit down with the non-Jewish Christians, but it was against everything he stood for. He was just being a phony, right? But when they, other Jewish Christians sent by James, arrived, he, Peter, began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. In other words, he was afraid that we're going to go back and turn him in. I saw Peter eating with Gentiles. Oh, man. So again, in the process of exposing Paul as a fake, don't think for one moment that I thought that the Jerusalem Christians were any better. They're all scum. But, you know, look at how hypocritical Peter was here. He did kind of the same thing Paul did, right? Paul said, "I've become a Jew to the Jews, a Greek to the Greeks." Peter was doing the same thing. When among the Jews, he acted like a Jew. When among the Gentiles, he acted like like he accepted Gentiles. They're all fake, aren't they? Of course they are, or were. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, Paul said, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. When I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in front of them all, "You are a Jew, yet you act like a Gentile and not like a Jew." Did you catch that? All the while, Paul claims to be on the side of the Gentiles, and he wants Gentiles to be accepted with the right hand of fellowship, and now he's condemning Peter for his hypocrisy, not being kind to the Gentiles once Jews showed up and didn't want to be exposed as compromising and hanging out with Gentiles. In the context of all of that, Paul condemns Peter here for acting like a Gentile instead of a Jew. In other words, "You're a hypocrite, Peter. You're like the Gentiles. Only Gentiles would do that." Wow. Here comes his arrogance again. "How is it," Paul said, "how is it that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? We who are Jews by birth and not sinful Gentiles know that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ." Did you catch that? He insulted the Gentiles again, didn't he? "We who are Jews by birth and not sinful Gentiles." We Jews aren't sinful. We're holy. We're the holy race, aren't we? Listen to this. How could anybody possibly have any respect, let alone reverence, for these scoundrels, Peter and Paul and James and John, and for the entire Christian religion and for the Bible itself, when they see what the hell it's actually saying? We can see from this that Peter finally and officially changed his position on abstaining from associating with Gentiles because Paul embarrassed him publicly. And thus it was not because, as Peter deceptively stated in Acts 10, God has shown me that I should not call anyone impure or unclean. Peter never admitted that he was humiliated at Antioch, and he was hoping that word never got back. Apparently it didn't, and Paul probably kept his mouth shut because to him it didn't matter. He got his way. He manipulated Peter by humiliating him into ceasing and desisting from not associating with Gentiles anymore. Although Peter probably still didn't do that in Jerusalem. But, actually he did it. From this point on, he had to. He did admit, because he stated before all of the Jews there, that I have now seen. And so he convinced them that they should accept this idea of, welcoming Gentiles now because God showed me in a vision. See how he had to blame it on God. And since God endorsed it now, it must be true. You can't deny this anymore. God might have told us to stay away from Gentiles in the past, yes, but now in this Christian era, I didn't know this before. Jesus never taught it to me. He must have forgot or something. But now God has revealed it to me in vision. You see both of these guys are monkeys. Paul and Peter, both colossal freaking liars. What was Paul motivated by, though, when he shamed Peter like this? Was it a genuine love for Gentiles? Look at how he told Peter, you are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How conceited and derogatory. And then he further told Peter, we are Jews by birth and not sinful Gentiles. Oh, yes, Paul loved the Gentiles, all right. Look at how he condemned Peter for his hypocrisy with his view of Gentiles, and yet Paul himself was guilty of the very same thing. Just like Paul condemned the Jewish Christians for observing, circumcision when he circumcised Timothy. He condemned them for, their dietary stipulations, which they got from Moses, which Jesus upheld. And yet all the while, Paul undoubtedly was still in favor of those things because he was inwardly still a Jew. He admitted it, right? He said, I'm a Pharisee. Just hypocrisy after endless hypocrisy. Look how he still kept the Jewish feast days, still observed the Nazirite vow, blah, 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 blah. Everything Paul condemned the Jewish Christians for, he was guilty of too. Obviously then, Paul did not castigate Peter out of disgust over his Gentile snubbing disposition. Rather, Paul did it because he needed to stay in character as a Gentile advocate, since his whole ministry, insurrectionist aims is what it was, but, his whole mission was predicated upon that premise of accepting Gentiles and being their friends, right? Plus, this was a good opportunity for Paul to make himself look like the good guy in the ongoing contention that he was having, with the Jerusalem leaders, Christian leaders, Peter and James and John, blah, blah, blah. It took attention away from them condemning him for not upholding Mosaic law, too, right? Now it looks like it was just over Peter's hypocrisy for not accepting you wonderful Gentiles, even though Paul could give a crap about Gentiles himself. Wow, what conniving, lying scam artists. Both of them. Peter faked that he liked Gentiles and ate with them when he was in Paul's presence, even though it was going against his own conscience and going against everything Judaism ever taught, and knew that if it got back to James, his own Jewish Christian community would condemn him, not to mention the general Jewish community, right? So Peter was fake. He wasn't true to his convictions any more than Paul was. They both played, once again, the same game of, I have become all things to all men, a Jew among the Jews, a Gentile among the Gentiles. Both of them complete fake fraud artists. Paul was hoping to make his opponents in Jerusalem look heretical so that he wouldn't look heretical, which he was. Peter obviously lied about what opened his eyes regarding the importance of associating with and accepting Gentiles, because he did not want to admit to his fellow Jewish Christians back in Jerusalem that he was publicly shamed and intimidated by Paul the heretic, right? Thus, again, he made up the story of God showing him the light on this matter. He probably paid off the few Jerusalem Christians that were present there in Antioch to keep what they saw under wraps. The biblical record of this story, part of which we touched on before, begins with verse 9 of Acts 10. It says, Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat. And while the meal was being prepared, he fell into a trance or a vision from Yahweh. He saw heaven opened and something like a large sheet being let down to earth by its four corners. It contained all kinds of four-footed animals, as well as reptiles and birds. Then a voice told him, Get up, Peter, kill and eat. Surely not, Lord, Peter replied. I have never eaten anything impure or unclean. The voice spoke to him a second time. Do not call anything impure that God has made clean. This happened 3 times, and immediately the sheet was taken back to heaven. This was all made up baloney. That's all this was. Again, to divert attention away from the fact that Paul is the one who actually changed his mind. He wasn't going to admit that, right? So he made up the story. It was a vision, figuring not only will this be a good cover for what actually changed my mind, but it'll get them to actually support me now with my new I love Gentiles attitude, because God showed me this in a vision. Later on, reflecting back on this alleged vision, Peter related in verse 28 what the interpretation thereof was supposed to be, which is the part of this story that we cited before. He said, You are well aware that it is against our law for a Jew to associate with or visit a Gentile, but God has shown me that I should not call anyone impure or unclean. Understand that in doing this, Peter actually was doing the same thing that Paul was being condemned for. He was trashing now the law of Moses, which Jesus said not one slightest portion would pass away until all is fulfilled. Peter was doing just that, but he was blaming God for it. You know, in case anybody called him on it. Well, wait a minute, the law, the books of Moses tell us that we are to not associate with Gentiles. We're not to marry them. We're not to allow them in our city. Yeah, but God showed me in a vision now that what was formerly considered unclean is now made clean. Again, even if Peter wasn't lying here and he, was convinced that he was given a vision, why would God wait till this point to show this to Peter? Why didn't Jesus make it clear? Hey, guys, I want to let you know, my mission isn't just for Jews. It's for Gentiles too, because God is the God of everybody. Never clarified it, never mentioned it, never gave any indication. On the contrary, he was a Jewish supremacist and left that example for them to continue to follow. Fearing that this vision story, though, might not be enough to convince his Jewish Christian cohorts that he now had good reason for accepting Gentiles into their fold, Peter went on to stage a fake outpouring of the Spirit that involved Gentiles speaking in tongues. He figured that will be the clincher. Sure, me telling them I had a vision, that will lay the foundation, but the final clincher will be when the Gentiles are shown to speak in tongues, that the Spirit is given to them too. That will show that God accepts them. So he staged it. He must have selected a few Gentiles, probably with help from Paul, who spoke several different languages, and give out the impression that, see, they're speaking in tongues too, like we are. They have the Spirit. God accepts them, so we should too. Unbelievable. This, thought Peter, would do the trick. Again, to give the impression that God now accepts Gentiles as well. Not just because of the dream I told you about, but now look at this, they're speaking in tongues. Acts 10:44-46 relates this story as follows. While Peter was still speaking these words, the Holy Spirit came on all who heard the message. The circumcised Jewish believers who had come with Peter were astonished that the gift of the Holy Spirit had been poured out even on Gentiles, for they heard them speaking in tongues and praising God. Clearly, Peter's trick had worked, and we can bet, again, that the enlisted Gentiles, that the Gentiles he enlisted, these actors pretending to be, converts, were probably provided by Paul, who, as we have seen, loved to engage in trickery, right? And this would have advanced his agenda, accepting Gentiles, because he wanted to use them to bring them right into Jerusalem later to engage in uprisings. So he had to force the hand of the Christian Jewish leaders and hopefully the non-Christian Jewish leaders to accept Gentiles in their presence, because he wanted to bring them in mass hordes. The whole idea for this charade may actually even have originated with Paul. Maybe Paul and Peter talked later. All right, Paul, you got me. You humiliated me. You made a complete fool out of me. All right, I'm going to go along with you. But how can we convince the Jews back in Jerusalem, the Christian and non-Christian Jews? What can we do to convince them? Paul probably came up with this idea. Hey, I'll lend you a few of my Gentile followers that speak multiple languages. You can stage a thing of make it look like the Holy Spirit came down and have it look like they're speaking in tongues. Hey, that's a good idea. All right, that'll work. I still can't stand you, Paul. Well, neither can I stand you, Peter. But let's shake hands and agree to go along with this scheme. You still stay in your court. I'll stay in my court for the most part. And we know that kind of thing went on, right? Paul and Barnabas, we'll get into that later, but they had a falling out. They went their separate ways. It wasn't uncommon. And we can guess why Barnabas couldn't work with Paul anymore. We'll get into that later, but you can probably already guess. Anyway, for those who prefer to accept Peter's version of the story, that a vision from God is what opened his eyes to embrace Gentiles, they would have to explain, as mentioned before, why the great Yahweh did not reveal this truth to Peter years earlier through his son, Jesus. Why did Yahweh wait until this late date? After Peter had been humiliated by Paul, he could have saved him that whole ordeal. So once again, we're going to blame the great Yahweh for this, right? Oh, Peter, forgive me. I should have told you this before when I was with you on earth. Damn it, I forgot. Oh, well, there goes my first semi-curse word I tried to avoid on this channel. Sorry about that. Anyway, but, this is so transparent, is it not? Did Yahweh forget to tell Peter this? Was this a, belatedly attached footnote that should have been on page 1? Amongst Peter and Paul being scam artists, we got to blame Yahweh for all of this confusion. He didn't do his job to inform them as he should have much earlier on. And of course, Jesus too, right? Got to blame them. What an incompetent deity. What a monkey. But we already know he's a monkey from all the previous discussions we've had, don't we? Worse than a monkey, he's a mass-murdering psychopath. Yahweh and Yahweh Jr. One of the main reasons that Peter capitulated to the pressure put on him by Paul, aside from the fear of a repeat performance of being humiliated again publicly, is quite apparent. Paul had been winning so many Gentile converts to Christianity that Peter fretted over a possible schism, again, that might erupt, right? Which would have caused the whole house of cards, the religion of Christianity to come crashing down if he resisted Paul too much. So Peter had no choice except to go along with this scheme. But do notice what a conniver Paul was. He played the intimidation game to get what he wanted, and all the while making Peter out to look like a fool. Paul didn't care what it took to get what he wanted. He intended to emerge the winner, and he did, didn't he? He knew he had a much greater army behind him and that he could pull pretty much whatever he wanted. And he did, over and over again. Though Paul finagled the Jewish Christians into accepting Gentile converts, please bear in mind that he was, once again, deep down inside, no less of a Jewish supremacist than Peter or even Jesus himself. We have already seen some evidence of this, but here's some more from Paul's own writings. First, we'll look at Romans 3, 1 and 2. Paul says, "What advantage then is there in being a Jew, or what value is there in circumcision? Much in every way," he said. First of all, the Jews have been entrusted with the very words of God. Even though Paul told his Gentile audience, there's no more Jew, there's no more Greek, we're all one in Christ, right? Then he turns around and says stuff like this. Here's another one. Again, from the book of Romans, chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. Paul said, "Hath God cast away his people," meaning the Jews? "God forbid! For I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God hath not cast away his people." Even though Paul said elsewhere that, quote, "there is neither Jew nor Greek," right? As though being Jewish was no longer of any importance. Notice how he here equated being part of God's people with having Jewish heritage. This was the real Paul talking here. Also in the book of Romans, chapter 1, verse 16, Paul wrote, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, and then to the Gentile." In other words, we're God's priority. Yes, he's interested in Gentiles too, but we're the most important. We come first. Again, Paul didn't care about God, nor did he care about Gentiles. He just said this to, stroke the ego of the Gentiles, to make them feel good and welcomed. But still, he made them second class, didn't he? In classic Jewish supremacist fashion. Romans 2:10, Paul said, "But glory, honor, and peace forevermore, who does good, first for the Jew, and then for the Gentile." Again, the same idea of Jews first, then Gentiles. Romans 9, 3-5, Paul wrote, "For I could wish that I myself were cursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my people, those of my own race, the people of Israel. Theirs is the adoption to sonship. Theirs the divine glory, the covenants, the receiving of the law, the temple worship, and the promises. Theirs are the patriarchs, and from them is traced the human ancestry of the Messiah." Romans 9, 3-5. Did Paul really believe when he said, "There's no more Jew, no more Greek"? Oh, baloney, he did. Here he is exalting his people again as being special, favored, above everyone else. Romans 11, 25-27. Paul also said this, "I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part," for rejecting Christ as the Messiah as a whole, "until," he said, "the full number of the Gentiles has come in." Paul is implying here that after the full number of Gentile converts to Christianity has come in, then things will turn around. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. This is why a lot of Christians today believe that a great conversion experience is going to take place in Israel, where there are great masses, great hordes of them are going to convert to Christianity. Or at least profess to, anyway, like they have done so many times in the past. That might be true. That might happen. Not because they genuinely believe in Jesus, but if they think that Christians can be manipulated again, like Paul was hoping for, not only hoping for, but did bring that about, and undoubtedly did use some of them in some of his insurrectionist plans. Maybe in the future, a good many Jews will at least pretend to convert to Christianity so they can sucker a lot of Gentiles. Who knows? Anything's possible. Keep an open mind. You just never know what's coming down the pike. I know one thing. There's a big movement to build the temple again in Jerusalem. A lot of Zionist Christian Jews and non-Jews alike are very big on that. And they think that that's going to ring in the end times and finally the second coming of Christ. They believe that Christ can't come again until a temple is built in Jerusalem. So they are actively working to help establish a Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Do you suppose there might be some other twisted agenda behind this? Keep that in the back of your mind. Anyway, this quote goes on to say, or Paul goes on to say in this quote, "As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will turn godliness away from Jacob. And this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins." Paul again is exalting his people here, isn't he? As being better, more special, more favored than the Gentiles. Predictably, Paul was bigoted against the Gentile Cretans. In Titus 1, verses 12 and 13, listen to what he wrote here. This is so disgusting, so judgmental. He made a blanket statement against this whole group of people by saying, "One of Crete's own prophets has said it. Cretans are always liars, evil brutes, lazy gluttons. This saying is true." Those are Paul's exact words. Go look them up for yourself. Did you know crap like that was in the Bible? Well, did you know any of this other crap we've been looking at throughout this entire series was in the Bible? But look at this. Paul is praised by Gentiles as a great man of God, and yet look what he said about this group of Gentiles. Titus 1:12, go look it up for yourself. "One of Crete's own prophets has said it. Cretans are always liars, evil brutes, lazy gluttons. This saying is true," Paul said. That is the genuine definition of prejudice right there, which means to prejudge. He has condemned across the board all Cretans, when in fact, even if that were true about the majority of them, not every single one of them was that way, but no, in Paul's estimation, it was. They're all that way. Well, he made similar statements about Gentiles across the board, didn't he? "We are not like sinful Gentiles." Remember that one? You gotta be kidding me. Anyway, we're going to stop there. We've reached our hour mark. Believe it or not, it gets even crazier as we go along. Paul, if you're not convinced already, you should be. But if you're not convinced already, stay tuned. We're going to see even more evidence, even more damning evidence against this monstrosity for the scumbag that he was. All right, guys. Once again, thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time. Take care.